Bruce Stokes, welcome to AICGS, Director of Pew Global Economic Attitudes. You have just released pretty much of a bombshell in terms of the surveys that you've done on Europe particularly, but of course we're interested in the German dimension. Right. But I guess I would start out with this question. This paints a fairly dismal picture.
Yes.
You called it the sick man of Europe syndrome. Europe's been in a funk for a while. Is this something that surprised you, or is this a continuation of other things that you've done because you've been at this for a long time? Is this different?
Well, there's a couple of differences. One is we released a report last year saying that there was a declining support for the European project. And I remember at the time thinking, well, it can't get much worse than this. Well, in fact, it did. And the title of the report, The Sick Man of Europe, European Union, is really a play on words on the economist's penchant for every several years. It does a cover story. First, Germany was the sick man of Europe, then France was the sick man of Europe. And I think our survey shows, no, we need to step back from this national focus and look more broadly at what one of the casualties of the crisis is. And it's not just the economy. It's not just that domestic political leaders are losing their jobs over this crisis. It is that people's faith in the European project, at least as we measure it in a variety of different ways, has really declined sharply. So you've got people don't accept in Germany. People no longer believe that economic integration is good for my country. That was the founding principle of the European Economic Community in 1957. Last year, in 5 of the 8 countries we surveyed, a majority had a positive view of the European Union as an institution. Now only majorities in 3 of the 8 have a positive view of the European Union as an institution. So there's this declining sense, and it's all tied to the attitudes towards the economy. I mean, if and when the economy would pick up, there's probably every reason to believe that these attitudes would pick up. The problem is the economy isn't picking up. In fact, this year is going to be worse than last year. And there's the real danger, most economists believe, that Europe won't really ever rebound, or at least in the short term won't rebound. It'll just have kind of an L-shaped recovery. It'll get up at 1% growth or something like that and kind of struggle along as Japan did for a decade or more. That probably doesn't bode well for the attitudes towards European integration and a deeper, broader Europe, which had been the driving force really in European politics and economics for 2 generations.
So a Europe that basically goes from an acute crisis into a chronic disease mode. And if that's the case, then your findings show a growing divergence between the so-called core countries, at least the ones that are doing quite well economically, and the periphery that is.
Well, I mean, there's a couple things there. One is we don't know what people would how they would react to a Japan-style stagnation, but I think it's probably safe to assume they wouldn't all of a sudden love European project more than they do now. In other words, the assumption that, if the economy picks up, we'll be back in good shape, only works if the economy bounces back dramatically. I think if it doesn't bounce back, all bets are off, but I think we shouldn't anticipate a strong rebound in attitudes. Now, your other question, though, which is about the periphery versus the core, or the periphery, the south versus the north, basically, in terms of attitudes. What was striking this year, which we did not see last year, was this pulling apart of Germany and France. The French, in their attitudes about a range of issues, increasingly look like Southern Europeans. And I know from my discussions in Berlin, this is the Germans' worst nightmare. That the French would not only have a slower performing economy, maybe Merkel and Hollande don't get along so well, but all of a sudden we see the French increasingly thinking like Southern Europeans. And that potentially poses all sorts of future problems for European cooperation, especially French-German cooperation, which, as we all know, has been the driving force of European politics for at least the last couple of decades, if not the last 2 generations. Economic creation of the single market, the creation of the euro, we're all driven by Paris and Berlin taking the lead.
Well, when you say that, do you also, the French-German divide is clearly critical, but did you find more synergy north of Germany, or I'm talking about Holland, I'm talking
Right.
about, the countries in the Scandinavian areas. Did you see that North Divide in this particular?
Well, unfortunately,
North-South
we only had enough money to survey 8 countries. So we didn't survey the Netherlands. We didn't survey Sweden, for example, or the Baltics. We did survey in Poland. And on some measures, the Poles and the Germans tend to think alike. There's not the kind of synergy between Polish and German attitudes that I might have expected, given this Polish elite idea, certainly advocated by Radek Sikorski, that we're hitching our wagon to the German star, and we've gotten over our German problem. The rest of Europe should too. That is not as self-evident in the Polish public opinion data as one might have expected from that elite discourse. But certainly the Poles, on a number of measures, do look and think about the world a bit like Germans.
Bruce, in looking at the data that you have and how you frame the questions, any indications on what the Europeans, and this needs to be broken down by countries, of course, would want to address the crisis, ideally?
It's very interesting. In 7 of the 8, it's jobs, jobs, jobs. We ask people, what would they like. First, we ask them what they think are the problems, and everything's a problem. When you feel this badly about the economy, everything's a problem. But when you ask them then, okay, among all these things, what would you like to see your government address first? It's jobs, except in Germany. And in Germany, there's a couple of interesting findings. One is the priority issue for the German public in terms of economic policy by Berlin is reducing the gap between the rich and the poor. Among the 39 countries around the world that we surveyed, the Germans were the only ones who said this is the highest priority. So will be interesting to see how this plays out in the fall elections, in the September elections. One would assume that the Social Democrats would have their own polls that would show the same thing and might make this a big issue. It is also a consequence, probably, of wage suppression in Germany. One of the pieces of advice that the Germans give the rest of Europe is, we went through our structural adjustment, you have to do that too. What was part of that structural adjustment was wage suppression. There are consequences to wage suppression. I'm not arguing whether it's good or bad, but you end up accentuating the gap between the rich and the poor, it would appear, and that creates its own political problems. So this is one of the consequences, I think, from German advice to the rest of Europe, which the Germans now have to live with. What was also interesting in the survey was we have all heard the narrative from German elites that our publics are inflation phobic. They were scarred by the hyperinflation of the 1920s, and thus we have no room for maneuver on monetary policy because our people are so afraid of inflation. In fact, the Germans were the least concerned about inflation of any of the European publics that we surveyed.
Who's more concerned about it?
Who's more? Everybody. The French, the Italians, the Spanish, the Greeks. So it is an interesting opening for a conversation, it seems to me, with German elites to say, look, it's not that your publics are unafraid of inflation. Everybody has a little bit of worry about inflation. But you seem to have, based on this data, more room for maneuver in terms of monetary policy than you would like us to believe. Let's have a discussion about
But that suggests strongly, and not just in the Franco-German situation, that the domestic plates, if you want to call
Yes.
them the political tectonic plates, are dangerously out of sync.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think this is one of the potential long-term costs of this prolonged euro crisis, is that it's not that Europeans always saw the world the same way or thought the same way or had the same priorities. It's just that they seem to be increasingly getting out of sync, and those who have suffered the most are coming more in sync. So you have a larger and larger group of countries, the victims of the crisis, which now include the French. Only 9% of the French think that the economy is doing well. They look a lot more like attitudes in Italy and Spain and even Greece than they do.
And the German figure on that?
The German figure is 74%.
Holy smoke.
Which suggests that when people think about the economy, they think about unemployment, because in fact, in the first quarter of this year, the German economy didn't grow almost at all. But unemployment is very low, which is testament to the German policy of of keeping people in jobs as much as possible, subsidizing keeping them jobs if possible. It's also a testament to the export orientation of the German economy and the success of that. It does also suggest that there may be more room for maneuver in German policy in terms of stimulating the economy without causing inflation, without causing debt to rise, because the Germans, reducing the debt is not a huge priority in Germany. If you would raise the minimum wage, which the Merkel government has said they endorse, which the SPT certainly endorses, you could put money in people's pockets, stimulate the economy more, reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, and do that without raising the government debt.
But probably, and then goes beyond the findings.
Yes.
The Germans would argue, the German government would argue, we are already on the way to doing that. But you shouldn't expect too much out of it.
Right.
What the findings suggest, to me at least, is the fact that if the German government sees, this government or the future government sees these findings and draws its own conclusions, they might conclude that it will be easier to back or at least tolerate additional measures, unconventional measures by the European Central Bank, because it has much more firepower, potentially at least, than a few German consumers that will never be able to uplift the whole of the Eurozone.
Well, certainly IMF studies have shown that increased consumption in Germany wouldn't necessarily spread to the rest of Europe as much as one might expect it would. That a lot of it would just induce more imports from China and other places.
Or buy German products.
Or buying more German
save
products.
the money.
Or save it. Right.
the money.
This is the thing we don't know, is that if you put more money in the consumer pockets, would they simply save it? We know in Japan, for example, that there's this perverse consequence in Japan that and it has to do with inflation, not money in your pocket, but if you think the inflation is going to increase, there are at least some surveys in Japan that suggest that people save more because they think, well, my car I'm going to buy is going to be more expensive next year.
Right.
In the West, we generally think if you have inflation, people say, well, I better buy it now because it's going to cost more in the future. What I don't know is if we know how the Germans would react to this. But it does seem to me that the data is the data, and one can always argue about public opinion data, but it does seem to me that there's elements here that open the conversation a bit more.
But the danger, Bruce, I mean, I was listening to a commentary this morning by Adam Posen at PIIE when he was, of course, predicting a long-term L-shaped development, even if there is an L at the end of it, or whatever the upswing would be, and whenever that would happen. If that's the case, let me turn the telescope around. What is it that we should be thinking about what we can expect from a Europe in that kind of malaise, if that's what it is?
Jack, I think this is the long-term issue that none of us are willing to deal with yet, is that if you talk to at least some European elites, economists, especially German economists and elites, they will make the argument, as they have done in some focus groups that I actually ran at the German Marshall Fund when I was there last year, that if you look at the long-term growth trends in Europe, they're 1.5% to 2%, going back to 1815 of all things. I mean, this is a long-term trend. So you combine that with the demographics of Europe, which are not good, aging population, low productivity, and I have had very senior German economists say to me, you can't expect more out of us than about 1.5% growth going forward.
That's what we hear.
It does seem to me that the world has to take that in and think that through, because if the world economy has run on, depending on how you count, 3 or 4 engines in recent years, the US engine, increasingly the Chinese engine, for a while at least it was the Japanese engine, but that seemed to have faltered, and it was the European engine. And if the European engine is going to sputter along at about 1.5% growth, that puts even greater pressure on China and Europe and the United States to carry world growth. Or we have to reduce our expectations for world growth. Now, over time, other emerging markets may help fuel growth. Some of the developing countries will help fuel growth. But it does pose serious questions about what we should anticipate for global growth.
Yes, I mean,
going forward.
That's one of the reasons why German economists are so obsessed with debt stock. Because of course, if that's the growth trajectory,
Right.
how are you going to reduce that debt stock?
Right.
But looking back, for instance, at the 90s, a lot of German economists will also point out when there was also growing divergence between the growth trajectory in the US and in Europe, they said, yes, but this is the aggregate. These are the total numbers.
Right.
But if you break it down and you take into consideration immigration or lack thereof
Right.
in Europe and other factors, even on productivity, they say we could scrap a few holidays and our productivity will grow
Right.
dramatically. If you look at per hour, labor per hour,
Right.
all those big differences suddenly don't look so big anymore.
Oh, absolutely. I remember a very senior Asian specialist, Ken Curtis, who you may know, was at that point working for Deutsche Bank back in the 90s, saying to me, if you looked at German productivity based on the number of hours that Germans actually work, the world should be frightened by this because the Germans are so efficient and they're so, they outstrip the Americans, they outstrip the Japanese. So I agree with you. I do think that what I found disturbing in the focus groups that we ran last year was that the Americans in these focus groups, the ones who were, myself and a couple others who were trying to helping coordinate it, came away thinking the Europeans, in this case the Germans, but it was the same in Warsaw, it was the same in Paris, it was the same in Brussels when we did this, there was incredible passivity in the face of this prospect. Whereas our intuition was if Americans were confronted with this same set of problems, they would say, well, we have to figure out how to solve this. We have to find a way to overcome it. Now, on one hand, that's a bit naive of Americans because these are huge. Demography may not be destiny, but it really does have a huge impact. History is not destiny, but it has a huge impact. On the other hand, it did seem to us that there was a passivity among Europeans that was quite disturbing. There wasn't this sense of, okay, yes, we have a demographic problem. How do we overcome this? How do we get more women in the workforce? How do we get more immigrants into the workforce? How do we preserve people's stay in the workforce longer? None of that attempt to kind of wrestle with the problem, unpack it, and try to solve it piece by piece. Rather, there was this sense of, really, there's nothing we can do. And anyway, what's this obsession with growth? Maybe we don't need to be
And that's
obsessed
the
with growth.
pushback that you're hearing now against austerity to some extent. But it's also, it really puts the enormous focus on leadership. And
Absolutely.
I can't imagine, you're in a country like France, Holland is in the cellar at the moment. Pick a country. You just have one where somebody is popular, and that is
In our survey,
Angela
Merkel is
Yeah.
the most popular politician in Europe,
in Europe.
even though it's fading a little bit. I mean, last year, only of the eight countries we did, only the Greeks had a negative attitude towards Merkel. Now it's the Spanish, the Italians, and the Greeks. But still, she's the most popular by far. As you say, Hollande is in horrible trouble in France.
Right.
I mean, his drop-off in his first year, it's my understanding, is the greatest of any French president. He's down in our survey at 33% think he's doing a good job handling the economy. Sarkozy last year was at 54% and he lost the election.
Right.
So there's a serious absence of belief in leadership. The same in the UK, the same in Spain. And I do think that because this is such a difficult problem, it's also because the population is giving leaders such mixed messages that you need great leadership to sort that out. I mean, in our survey, for example, the public says our number one priority is jobs. And yet, there's still strong support in many countries for austerity, of cutting public spending. Because people, for whatever reason, still believe that debt is a major problem and has to be dealt with. Well, that's really a contradiction.
Yes.
Because the alternative we gave in our question was, do you want to cut public spending to reduce the debt? Do you want to spend more money to stimulate the economy? And except in places like Greece and Italy, everybody said we got to cut some more.
Really?
Yes, but there will be an explanation for that. And the explanation would be exactly what Jack and you just pointed out. Lack of leadership is basically growing distrust.
I totally agree.
In the state and in
I mean, we can't
government
prove that from our data, but I think it's one
wait
of
a
the
minute.
potential.
There is this latest report from the Marshall Fund on the Transatlantic Academy where they
Yes.
talk about the governance
Yes.
crisis and those things. It's obviously a transatlantic disease at some point or another.
Yeah.
But let's finish up here, because I think that the important consequences for us here is, we can't pivot away from Europe, and Europe can't pivot away from us. But if the scenario is, 5 years of this, maybe 10? I mean, a Japan outlook? I've heard that.
Yeah.
People say, if you want to know where Europe's heading, look at Japan.
Right.
That's a frightening prospect. And the question, I guess, is, if that's the case, what do we need to do? Did you draw any consequences from the survey as to what the expectations of the United States are? Was there anything that said, you can do something here?
We did not ask questions about that. I mean, clearly the Obama administration thinks that this transatlantic trade and investment TTIP agreement would be a way for the U.S. to help a bit in structural adjustment in Europe and stimulating the economy. Possibly even more importantly, is inspiring a bit of confidence in the future of Europe, because obviously the economic benefits would take time to sort themselves out.
And probably also to regain a significant seat at the table within Europe itself.
Right, and I think that given our own limitations in the United States, the fact that there's not much we could do directly. Right. B, if there were a crisis and financial aid was needed from the U.S., it might be very hard to produce it.
Especially after the last 4 years.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And given our own kind of economic problems and the fact that we seem very reluctant to even fulfill our pledges to the IMF that we've already committed ourselves to but haven't actually funded yet. So I think there's a variety of constraints that I think the Obama administration feels, and so this is why this TTIP, I think, they feel is an important contribution they can make, maybe the only contribution they can make. But I think more fundamentally to your question, we are looking to Europe, or have looked to Europe in the past, as a partner to deal with a variety of global issues. Prolonged stagnation in Europe is going to make that financially much more difficult for Europe to deliver on in terms of defense spending. I mean, we continue to complain about Europe not spending enough on defense, and in fact, Europe is cutting defense even further, as we are, and we'd love to see Europe pick up some of the weight. We know from the Libya experience that at the end of the day, the French and the British ran out of munitions, and we had to supply them. As we look forward to Syria and what might have to be done there, can we count on the Europeans to help out? I don't know, but we know from our own surveys that the European publics don't want to get engaged in Syria, even less so than our publics do, and our publics really don't want to do that either. We have Iran looming on the horizon, which could cause a huge problem, both in terms of what we do, because European publics don't want to engage in military action with Iran. American publics would, if need be, do that. But more broadly, what does the alliance do together post whatever would be done? In other words, how do we work together?
It's an interesting point. When you talk about the respective catalysts for Europe, it was, looking back in 1945, it was saying never again. We're not going to do this anymore. So they go in and they sign the Rome Treaty in '57, and then that basically carries the momentum right through to the present. That's now 70 years ago, and it seems to me that if you're looking for a catalyst, we thought maybe, this crisis in 2008, 9, 10 would have been a generation of people saying, God, we got to really get our act together, otherwise it will be a problem. If we are seeing what you're seeing in this poll, again, I come back to my model here of tectonic plates that are shifting apart or looking inward.
Right.
And look at Britain with its looming referendum.
Well, what's very interesting is, our poll showed that 46% of Brits want to leave and 46% want to stay in the EU.
Holy smoke.
And depending on how you interpret that, that's good or bad. I had a Liberal Democratic politician in Britain say to me, "We can work with this. It's not as bad as we thought."
But it's a close call.
But when you're at that tipping point, 46 to 46, any untoward event 2 months before the referendum could tip the balance. What is interesting in presenting this survey data around Europe, a question that came up again and again from audiences and officials was, we think that there is growing political polarization, a pulling apart domestically in our various polities.
Sounds familiar, Bruce.
It does sound very familiar. And this is what we're really worried about,
Right.
is because that leads to increasing difficulty in governing,
Right.
and increasing difficulty in having a unified position in Europe to deal with what is clearly an ongoing crisis, which is not going to get better anytime
And then
soon.
finally, the final, you're talking about leadership issues. You got elections in Germany, you have now elections, there are always elections.
Yeah.
Then you also have the changing of the guard in Brussels.
Right.
Who is going to step into that role? Who is going to be the kind of adrenaline-filled Jacques Delors of the 90s? I find it difficult to imagine who that can be.
Well, I can tell you, at least having been in Brussels just yesterday, when you ask people what are the rumors, what's the scuttlebutt, what's nobody has any good rumors at this point. Now we're still a year out, etc. But I think the bigger question is, do the national leaders in Europe understand that strong leadership in Brussels is almost a prerequisite for European unity on dealing with some of these big issues? Or will the national leaders say, I want no one who could countermand me in Brussels, so we're going to put some weak person in these various jobs, and that way the European Council can continue to dictate. Now, in theory, that was another way to run Europe. But if the assembled leaders who sit in council, in the European Council, are weak themselves at home domestically, they aren't necessarily strong personality types, except for Merkel, where does that take Europe in the future? Except to a Germany that drives the train even more, and that creates potentially even more resentment.
And you have, as some people referred to it, Germany being the reluctant hegemon.
Right.
And even though I think that many people think that Merkel is the chairman of the board de facto, they don't want to get that formal role out there in the public. We got a lot of grist out there, Mr. Stokes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
We'll discuss this further.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.